So, welcome back. Today we're going to go over Chapter 4. There's quite a bit actually in here in Chapter 4, so I'm going to break this up into more than one video probably. So just a heads up, this will probably be in two parts. So you can watch those as you kind of see fit, but you'll probably need to finish both parts before starting on the labs for Chapter 4. All right, so let's get to it. So we started talking a little bit about CSS last week. We're going to talk a little bit more in depth about a lot of things with CSS in Chapter 4, Chapter 5. I mean, that's going to be our main focus for the next few chapters, is to really take a deep dive on some CSS tools and styling methodology. Okay? So, objectives for Chapter 4. Given an HTML document, we want you to be able to create a CSS style sheet using a variety of different selectors and roles and be able to apply CSS to it. I also want you to be able to use the developer tools to go and look at the existing CSS that's there, see how it's working, debug it, whether that be CSS that you've written or CSS that somebody else has written, to be able to go see what's going on and why are those rules being applied the way they are and such. Because there are plenty of cases where you may say, here's the code I wrote, this should be doing this, but when you look in the browser, it's doing something maybe different than what you had intended. So as you're writing CSS, it's a very good idea to take a look at what the browser says is actually doing with it. And then also looking at HTML and CSS and being able to predict and understand what that's going to do. You know, if I apply this rule to these tags, the output is going to be this, and to be able to write selectors for that. So we'll talk about three different ways that you can incorporate CSS into a web page. The primary route that we'll be using is through an external style sheet, which you've already kind of gotten introduced to, but there's some other ways to do it as well, which are occasionally helpful, but won't be our prime focus for this semester. We also want to talk about why it's best generally to put all your styling into that external style sheet rather than using the other two methods we're going to talk about briefly. We'll talk a bit about normalized CSS and what the purpose of that is. In that process, we'll talk a little bit about the reset selector, which is another way of doing that. Both here and in Chapter 5, we'll touch on that again. But that's reset selector used to be the old way to kind of do this. Normalized CSS is the new way. We'll talk a bit about distinguishing between, say, absolute measurements and relative measurements. The book has kind of one opinion on that. I'd say that my opinion's a little bit different, but we'll get to why that is. And just part of that's, having worked with the technologies and in practice, it's maybe there's the distinction between absolute and relative is maybe a little bit more hazy. We're going to talk a little bit about, the three different ways to specify CSS. We talk about that. There's a newer version of CSS called CSS3, which adds a number of new features. Most browsers support it at this point because it's actually kind of old. It's been around for several years now. But there are a lot of new features in CSS3 which make things look a lot better. We'll talk about a few different types of selectors. We'll talk about the universal selector, the type selector, the ID selector. We'll talk about class selectors, descendant selectors, yada, yada, yada. Those selectors are probably one of the most important things to pay attention to in this particular chapter, that bullet point 6. Because we'll be using those selectors a lot in everything we do this semester, whether it be from the CSS, which we're going to be working on for the next few weeks, or it be the JavaScript stuff that we're going to do later in the semester as well. All of that really relies on you understanding how these selectors work and getting familiar with them to be able to say, here's the tags I want to refer to. So that's a really good thing to make sure you know well. We'll talk a little bit about accessibility guidelines for the pseudo class selectors. We'll talk about using important to make rules kind of override other rules or make them more specific. We'll talk about working with fonts. So, setting what font family is there, what font style, weight, size. Several of these properties we'll work through. So that's kind of our gist for this chapter. So the big things to pay attention to there is the different kinds of selectors, and we'll go through that. And then the units of measure. There's maybe not enough in here to talk about. That's a pretty deep topic, and that's talking about the units measure and how that works is something we will probably continue talking throughout the rest of the semester, because it's just important to understand what kind of units to pick and where should you pick those units and the why, because there's a few different ones to pick from, and it just takes some practice and some knowledge and some experience to figure out, okay, well, I should use this unit here and that unit there and such and things, and what are our options and what's a good way to work things. So we'll continue talking about measurements, and then talking about fonts, because every page that we write will have text on it. So knowing how to style that text is kind of important. Okay, so there's a few different ways to apply CSS to our web page. The first and the most predominant one is to move it out of the HTML and have it in a separate file. So typically we're going to call that main.css, and I'd put that into a CSS folder. Here they call it main CSS, and they're putting it into a styles folder. You can do it either way. I tend to call that folder CSS. Some people this textbook calls that folder styles. But that's the most common way, is to take it out of the HTML, put it in a separate file. Benefits of that. First of all, that means that then I can reuse that same CSS style sheet for all of my website, all of my different pages. I don't have to, say, copy code from page to page to page. I just say, hey, this page uses my common style sheet, and that makes things fairly simple to keep the website looking the same regardless of what page you're looking at. So if you've got 100 pages, using one external style sheet is really, really a must, rather than making copies of that for every single page. So that's the primary way we're going to do that. Another way that you can add CSS is you can actually embed it into the HTML file. So inside the head tag, instead of putting a link to an external file, you can add a style tag. Starts with style, ends with style, and put your own custom rules. Now, those rules that are then embedded, we call that an embedded style sheet, those are specific to that page. So if there are, again, going back to the case of, let's say you have 100 pages, maybe you have some styling that only applies or may only make sense on that page. Well, that's where I would put it into an embedded style sheet if it only is needed for that single page. Now, one of the upsides of having an external is it means that the users can download that file once and then not have to download it again. Anything you put into an embedded style sheet, that's text and code that the user has to download every single time they visit that page. And that may mean, again, if you have all of your code in an embedded style sheet, well, you're downloading that many, many more times than you need to. So it's usually best to, as much as possible, to move it into an external style sheet. A third option that you can use is to add it as a style using the style attribute. So I can apply this to a specific tag. So here I'm saying this one specific H1, I want to have a font size, I want to make the font bigger, and I want to make it red. Okay, so this applies specifically to that tag and no other tags on your website. This is the one that you basically never want to do. This means that it's kind of mixed in with your HTML, which is your semantic part of the website, and rather than being out there somewhere else where it's like, hey, here's the styles that are uniform for the entire website. So if I want to say change this color from, maybe it's not red, maybe it's a little bit orangish, well, I'd have to go change all of these H1s now that I have that word directly, because these, what we call these inline styles, which is this third option, they always override both of the other ways of doing things. So if you set it here, that means this is the way it is. It doesn't matter what you set in your style sheet, it will now be red. Whether you set it in an embedded style sheet or an external style sheet, if you apply an inline style, that takes over. So those are things that you can do. You can put things as an inline style, but if you ask most professional developers, they'll say you don't ever want to do this. This is always a bad idea in the long run, because you'll always end up kicking yourself once you want to like retheme the website or change how things look, or say have a dark theme. You can do that if you have an embedded an external style sheet. You can easily switch between, say, different themes, like a light theme and a dark theme, but that's virtually impossible if you use inline styles. Okay, so you can use that third option, but really, please, if you would, the general best way to do things is usually put it into an external website, an external style sheet. Okay. One thing to know as far as these three different approaches are concerned, I've kind of touched on this a little bit, but first of all the styles from your external style sheet are applied to the page. Next is the embedded style sheets, embedded styles, and then finally the inline styles. They're always done in this order. So what that means is anything you have in an embedded style sheet will override what's in your external style sheet. Anything you have in an inline style will override both of the previous levels. Okay, so the more specific you need to be, that's kind of where you would put it. Okay. However, one of the things that I would say, one of the reasons that the inline styles are maybe an issue, is oftentimes you might start out with saying, okay, this style I'm only going to apply to this one page in this one place, and then before you know it, a few months go by and that style that was in one place is now in 20, because it's more often than not, once you start putting that style in, there's going to be other places that then need to be consistent with that styling. So it's usually best to go ahead and say, if I'm going to do this once, I'm probably going to end up needing to do it more than once. So an example of how this might look, here we have a head tag, we've got a title, we've got two spreadsheets in here. So we have main CSS, which would be the style sheet for the entire website. But this is then a page for a specific speaker. So we actually have two external style sheets. One for the page as a whole, the website as a whole, that's used for all the pages. And then on top of that, we're applying specific styles for this page, for this group of pages. So speaker pages maybe look a little bit different than the rest of the website. So that's how we would do this. So if we have it in this order, the main styles, the website wild, are applied first, and then the speaker-specific styles are applied next. So the order that these things get applied in is maybe to be a little bit more granular. If there's more than one external style sheet, they get applied from first to last. If there's more than one embedded style sheet, they get applied first to last, and then finally inline styles. That's kind of the whole order of things. Okay. Now, one tool that we can use, which is very helpful in this kind of regard, is something called Normalize CSS. And what it does is it makes a lot of the differences between how browsers render your page, and it takes a lot of those and then makes them more uniform. So there's differences with how different versions of IE render websites. There's differences with how, Firefox and Chrome and Safari and all your different browsers have made some slightly different decisions about how your website should look out of the box. So normalized CSS contains a bunch of rules to make those more uniform than what they would be out of the box. So typically what we're going to do is we're going to use this before our main CSS. So you'd see normalize.css and then main.css. Now, the way to incorporate this into your website, first you're going to go out to that URL here. Let me click on that and pull that up. You're going to see that there is a download button here. So we're going to click on that, and that will pull up the CSS file here. Okay, so we need to actually get that into a project. So the way I get that into a project, I'm going to say I right click here, and I'm going to say save as, and then I would save it to wherever I need it. So for instance, if I want to put it into one of my projects, I might go to D projects AWD 1000. Let's see, I want to go to maybe homework. This would be chapter 4. So maybe I make a new folder called CSS here, CSS, and I would drop normalize.css into that folder. Okay, so now I can use that in my project. Okay, so that's what I would do there. Bring that in. The next thing I would do then is go to actually open the project. Switch this so I can see my screen. All right, so I'm going to go to File, Open Folder, and let's open up that homework chapter. Okay, so homework 4, work 4. Open up this folder. You can see I've got an index.html here. Right now that's just blank, and I've got a normalized CSS document. Okay, so let's get this set up. So I'm going to go do hashtag, hit enter. It's going to pre-populate that in there, and then I want to link up with that CSS file. So I would put this in here, link rel is equal to style sheet, and then the href would point to CSS, normalize.css. So that's then going to be applied to that page. Now let me put in some dummy text. And a paragraph of just lorem ipsum. All right, so we can just kind of see how this is going to work. I'm going to format the document real quick. There we go. Okay, so let me run this in live server. So here's what that page looks like, and that's just with normalized CSS applied. Let's see what happens if I remove that. Okay, so you're going to see that there's initially a little bit of margin and padding and such that gets added over there on the left. There's a little bit of extra space. And this does remove that with the intent of making browsers more uniform. So that does mean once you add in normalized CSS, there may be some things you have to go back and add if you didn't do that initially. So this is the first style sheet we want to have in there. I want to add another style sheet for my specific file, my specific styles. So I'd say rel equals style sheet href. This is going to be CSS / main.css. I would create that main CSS file in here. So new file, main.css. There we go. So that's the basic setup. We save all that. We can see it here. But I might want to go put in some sort of custom rules. So let's say that I want to make my header blue. So color blue, and maybe let's give the paragraph color green. There we go. So you can see that that's applied. Now, notice that it is important that the order of this is fairly important. If I were to, for instance, switch some of these around, actually I might need to put in some additional styles before I do that. So let's say I want to apply some space on the left. So let's do that. So I'm going to go up to body, and I'm going to put some margin, which is going to be maybe 30 pixels. Okay, so you see that just gives me some space. Now, what I want you to see is if you switch those two style sheets, you're going to have some different behavior. So if I say, let's switch this here to be in reverse order. So we have the main first and the normalized second. You'll notice that some of the rules that I apply in my main CSS are now not being applied. They're being overwritten by the normalize, right? So the normalize is meant to get us to a baseline where roughly all the browsers are close enough. They're basically the same. And then we apply our custom stuff on top of that. If we get these out of order, you can see that we're going to have problems with applying our CSS. So it's definitely a must to make sure when you're adding this normalize, you add it as the very first script. And then your main and your custom CSS comes after that. Okay. So that's how I would set up that process. Let me go back to my slides. So there's a few different common units of measure that we can use in CSS. One is pixels. We use px short for that when we're specifying pixels. That represents a single dot on your screen. Then we have pts, short for point. That's 1/72th of an inch. That's kind of seems like maybe an interesting choice of measure. Why would we pick 1/72th, 72nd? That's down to print. Originally in the print world, even before computers really came on the screen, and computers quickly adapted this as soon as we had printers, we came up with this idea of a point, right? So a point is the smallest measure when you're talking about printed documents, and that's where this idea comes from, is from print. So that's where you see, like, typically when you use fonts in Word or such, you might say this is a 12-point font or a 14-point font, 18-point font. Well, that is a physical measure. That 18-point or 20-point corresponds to a particular measure on a physical measure on the printed page. So for instance, if I say I have something at a 72-point font, it should always be printed at an inch in height. Regardless of what printer you use, that printer should always print 72 point as an inch in height. So that's where that's correlated. There's also units in in CSS that we can use called EM and REM. So EM represents what is the height of an uppercase M in the current font for that current element. Okay, so it's kind of what we could refer to as relative. The book refers to PX and PT as quote-unquote absolute units, and the rest as relative units. And that means that, in some sense, the PX and PT are defined. It's like, here's what they are. They don't change, regardless of what element you're working with, regardless of the context of the HTML. Whereas the other units here are generally relative to the styling that's applied to the HTML already. Okay, so EM is relative to the size of the current font. So one EM would be the current font size. REM, on the other hand, is basically like EM, but it's not relative to the current, it's relative to the root HTML tag. So whatever font size you put on the root, let's say I put 14 pixels as my root font size, well then 1.0 one rem is equal to 14 pixels. If my root font size is 20 pixels, then 1 rem is 20 pixels. So that's how that kind of works. The other thing we can use is percentages. Percentages are based on whatever the current value is. So that could, if we're working with, say, font sizes, 100% would be the current font size, 200% would be twice as big. Typically, anywhere you're using percent, you could use rem instead, and usually rem is a little bit more readable in terms of font sizes rather than using percentages. There are also other units that we can use for measure. One is VH. They're what we call viewport units, or viewport height units, and that is equal to 1% of the viewport height. Now, what is the viewport height? Well, the viewport height is the amount of space that you have here that the page is being rendered in. So right now the viewport height would be from here, beneath the address bar, down to my status bar. So that would be the viewport height. So 1 VH would be 1% of that. If I go change the height of my browser like so, well, now I have a new viewport height. So a VH unit would now be 1% of that. It's 1% of what is that visible space that you have available. Same thing with the VW units. VWs are relative to the width of your viewport. So I have a viewport here, I have a smaller viewport here. So that's, again, both of those. 1 VH is 1% of the height, and 1 VW is 1% of the width. We won't do too much with VH and VW right now, per se, but they're very helpful for page layout when we actually go to dealing a little bit more with page layout in a few chapters. So keep those in mind. Now, one thing we might want to talk about is what is really a relative unit. What's the difference between a relative unit and an absolute unit? And if you're thinking about it in terms of relative to the styles that are applied already or the font size, then it would appear that PX and PT, that these are absolute units and the rest are relative. So if they ask you on the homework, that's what they mean. But really, at a more deep level, all measurements are relative. And that actually is pretty important from talking about what the user experience is going to be as you're creating these pages. So really, every unit that you create is relative. It's relative to something else. It's relative to some standard. So a pixel represents a single point on your screen. A single point on your screen. Now, that size of the pixel isn't a fixed quantity. Okay, so if I were to look at what my screen looks like right now, okay, so you can see what size, the text is here right now. Well, you may or may not know to do this in Windows already, but if I go to here, right click on my desktop, go to display settings. Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to change the resolution of this monitor. Okay, so that's, for me, that's monitor 2 right now. Right now it's set to 1920 by 1080. Well, if I go change this, let's say I change this down to 1024 by 768. Let's keep those changes. Well, let's look at that text now. Technically, at least for my perception, and you may not see this on the recording because it's also gone and changed the size of the window, these letters are now bigger for me because the pixels are bigger. And because what happens really, the size of a pixel is relative to two things. It's relative to the density. So the density, we talk about screen density. Screen density is the number of pixels over a particular physical measurement. So we'd say it's maybe my display is 300 pixels per inch, or 100 pixels per inch, or 72 pixels per inch. That's my density. So I can kind of use that as a conversion factor between this number of pixels is this number of inches, right? Or this number of points. So really, as my density changes, as I change my screen resolution, I am changing how big a pixel is. Go back to 1080p. So when I'm thinking about what units are relative and such, really both pixels and points are relative to that screen density and that screen resolution. So if, in fact, there's a formula. If I say, let's take the pixels, divide it by density, well, that gives me the size of that element in points. And I can go the reverse way. I can say, let's take the points, number of points that I've told it, that size is, whether it be width or height or font size. I can say, multiply that by the density, and that gives me how big it is in pixels. So there is a way to go back and forth between pixels and points, but the thing to notice there is that there's a conversion ratio that changes based on the device that you're using to view the content. So if I say that my text should be 14 pixels tall, well, then it's going to be one height on certain devices, and then larger or smaller on other devices. So it may be that on your old monitor, that 14 points is actually pretty, so that 14 pixels is actually pretty tall, versus if I were to go pull it on a newer, put that onto a newer 4K monitor, that 14 pixels is going to be tiny. So these units are not, there is no such thing as a really truly absolute unit. Everything when we're talking about measuring things in CSS is really relative to something. So picking the right measurement, picking the right unit really comes down to figuring out what should that element, what should that property be relative to, right? If we're talking about points and pixels, it's relative to the screen density. So if I'm using pixels, then the higher the screen density, the smaller it's going to be. If I'm using pixels, the higher screen density, the smaller it's going to be. The lower the screen density, the bigger it's going to be. scales in what we might say in mathematical terms. You say that the physical dimension scales inversely with the screen density, versus point is the other way around. The higher your screen density, the more pixels that point represents, and those points represent, and the lower your screen density, the fewer pixels that point gets translated to. Okay. EM's obviously relative to the current font size. Similarly, rem is relative to the root font size, the font size of the HTML element rather than the element that you apply it to. Percent always relative to whatever the value is currently. So if the value currently is 15 pixels, well, 200% is going to be 30 pixels. So it's always relative to the current value. And then as we, VH and BW are pretty straightforward. They're relative to the size of the viewport. So right now, if I'm looking at the size of this window, the size of this page, VH is determined based on that size of the viewport. So if I change the size of the viewport, that changes the size of a VH. So those are things we need to keep in mind. All right, so let's talk about how we use this a bit. So we'll talk about how to apply some of these measurements to an actual document. So I'm going to pull this up. I'm going to go to examples. So open folder. Let's go back up to Murach HTML4 book examples. I'm going to look at the chapter 4 examples. So select this folder and let's open up the measurement example with live server. Okay, so I've got the code for it on the right, and I've got the actual what it looks like in the browser on the left. So we can see here is the actual HTML for it. We've got a header. Inside of that, we've got an H1, and then we've got a main with a paragraph type inside of that. There's a little bit more text that's off the screen there. So that's roughly what we have. Let me make that there. Okay, so we can see here's the HTML and here's the CSS that we're applying to it. So we're saying that we want the font size to be 100% or what it is normally. We're saying that we want to apply some margin over to the left and to the right, so that's going to give it some space. You can see that we're specifying the margin in EMs. We're specifying the font size in percentage. Here we can also see with the header, which would be this top part. We're specifying that there's a little bit of padding on the bottom of it. So that would be between here and the paragraph. Or no. Padding would be between the line and the text. So that's the padding. So let's say I move this up to 3. You're going to see that there's more space between this line and the text. But we're saying 0.75 EM. So that's 75%, of the height of one of these letters. That's how we're specifying the padding. So recognize that that's going to be the 75.75 EM. That's going to be a different size in pixels here than it might be for this font size. That would get a different padding. You'll next see that we're specifying a border, a 3-pixel border. So that's the line here. And the thickness of that line is that 3 pixels. Okay. We're also seeing that there's some margin applied. So that margin is the space from the bottom of the line to the text. So there we're specifying as 1.5 EM. So 1 letter and a half basically in the font of the header. And then for the H1, I'm specifying that, okay, I want that to be twice the normal font size. Okay. and I'm specifying that there is no margin underneath the H1. So one thing to know with measurements, if I want to specify something as 0, 0 really has no unit. So I could say 0 pix, but regardless of what unit I use, when I'm talking about 0, 0 is 0. So when you're putting in 0, you don't have to put a unit for that measure. Any other value that's non-zero, you do have to specify what the unit is. But specifically for if you want to set whatever property it is, whether it be margin or padding or border, if you want to set that measurement to 0, you just say 0 without a unit, because the unit doesn't really matter. So if I compare what this looks like without the CSS, and we can kind of put this in piece by piece. So I'm going to do Control/ to hide each of these settings one by one. So if I didn't have any of this CSS applied, it would look something like this. If I add in the CSS maybe for the body, you can see that that adds the space over on the left and the right. If I add in this styling for the header, you can see that this comes in like that. So you can see that there's now a border underneath. There's some spacing. You can see there's a lot of spacing right here. Right? There's a lot of spacing between this text and between the H1. Well, that's because two things. Well, first of all, we have some padding in here, but we also have some margin on the H1 that's inside of it. So that's where when we add this, we've pulled the margin down to 0, so there's less space between the H1 and the header. So that's what that did. So what you can see here, we're using a few different measurements, but really the three big ones that we've got here is we've got pixels for the border, and we've got EM anytime we're specifying either margins or padding, and then we're using percentages for the font size. I would generally say it's best to use just EM for the font size as well, but this is the way they've got the example set up. Some just recommended practices, because we've talked about a lot of these units, and a good question to ask is, well, given all of that, what units should I use for what? So general good recommended practice for specifying the root font size, so specifying the font size of the HTML tag, I would use pixels. That's usually the good way to go, is start with your baseline as being in pixels. Any borders or outlines that you have, outlines are very similar to borders, you want to specify those in pixels. And the reason is all of the other units have some sort of rounding error because they have to be converted to pixels. And typically you want your borders to be clean lines. You want them to be even, a whole number of pixels. You don't generally want to have a border that's half pixels. So if I were to maybe look at what that looks like, if I were to have a border with half pixels, let's say here I'm going to change this from being 3 pixels to maybe 2.5 pixels. And depending on how this is kind of seen, reset. So depending on where you kind of sit, sometimes those half pixels, sometimes they'll be rendered well, sometimes they'll result in a sort of fuzzy edge. Maybe I try 0.2. Those can sometimes, if you have not whole pixels, those have to be rendered as what we would say aliased. Because you can't render really a partial pixel. So having fuzzy borders like that usually is not a good thing. So you want to generally specify all of your borders in whole pixels. Next off, with any sort of font sizes that you have in the rest of the document, you generally want to specify those relative to the root font size, so you're going to specify those as rem. Any margins or padding, you want to generally specify those as rem. The reason you don't want to necessarily specify those as em is typically margins and padding, you don't want that to be relative to, you actually really don't want that to be relative to the current font size of the thing you're trying to apply padding and margin to. Usually you want that to be pretty independent. So it's actually best to use rem for both padding and margin as a just good rule of thumb. That will cause you the least headache if you consistently use rem for margin and padding. The book uses largely em for margin and padding, and part of that is just the time it was put out. At the time that the book was published, rem wasn't as standard, wasn't as supported by all the browsers as it is now. So rem's pretty widely supported by browsers, so I would recommend moving over. As well, we'll talk more about width and height and some of these things in Chapter 5, but if you are going to specify the width or the height of an element, I would generally recommend that you specify that in rem as well. That's not a hard and fast rule. There are a lot of different things you can use for width and height, but rem is definitely one of those ones to consider. And then finally, we're talking about how you lay out the page. VH and VW are very good for page layout type things. Again, we'll talk more about page layout in the upcoming chapters, so keep that in mind. So the main two units that you should do most of your labs and your homework with for Chapter 4 should really be pixels and rem. That would be my expectation. Follow the specific guidance in the lab and the homework, but these are kind of good rules of thumb, is use pixels for your borders and rem for your margin and padding and font sizes. All right, let's look at the next slide. So if I'm looking at, so we talked about measurements. The next thing we want to talk a little bit about is colors. So there's a few different ways in CSS to define what color should something be. So if I use the color attribute, this is going to change the color of the text. Okay, so color is the text color. You can kind of think of it this way. I can specify that color either by name. So here I'm saying that I want it to be red. There's a few different constants that are common in there, from red, green, blue. There's quite a few more that are mentioned in the book. So check your book for this, and as well as there's some documentation you can find online. So you can specify it by the name of the color, red, black, white, etc. You can also specify it using RGB values, short for red, green, blue. So there's two ways to do this. You can say RGB, and then you can specify it as numbers from 0 to 255. So 0 would be black or all off, and 255 would be all on or white. And we kind of do that on a per channel basis. So how much red do you want, how much green do you want, and how much blue do you want? You can either specify those as 0 to 255, or you can specify those from 0% to 100%. So you can see with this, this is a lot of red, a little bit less green, and a little bit less blue. So it's largely this color would largely come out as being kind of an off red. I think if I pull up example 4 and run this in live server, we can see some examples here. Yeah. So 0 to 255, we're going to do that as percentages. We can also specify colors, and this is really what we would refer to as sort of a shorthand format, is these hexadecimal values. Okay, so these hexadecimal values, they always start with a hash, and then they have 6 digits. Okay, so 2 digits for red, 2 digits for green, and 2 digits for blue. Okay, so these are still RGB values. And basically the way this works, well, 0 is 0, FF is 256. Okay, now we say hexadecimal because that's the base we're using. So decimal numbers go from 0 to 9. Hexadecimal numbers are actually base 16. So they actually go from 0 to 15. Well, we don't have digits for 10, 11, 12, etc. So we just use letters. So when we're talking about hexadecimal, it's each of these digits are hexadecimal digits, which means they go from 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and then after 9 comes A, which is 10, B, which is 11, C, which is 12, E, which is, am I off? Yeah, E, which would, I don't know, B is 11, C is 12, D is 13, E is 14, and F would be 15. So that's how this kind of works out. This may seem a little bit counterintuitive to specify colors this way, this hexadecimal format, but it's honestly the most shorthand format that you can use, and with a little experience, you'll definitely get used to it. The other nice thing about using this format is there's a lot of tools online which will give you these hexadecimal codes, and then you can just copy and paste them into where you want to use, into your website. So for example, let me pull up one of these. If I go out to Adobe, I think it's actually color.adobe.com. They've got a really nice palette picker, so you can kind of build your own palette from this. Well, as you're building this, it will give you the hexadecimal code for each of these. So if I want to just take this and use it in my website, there's the hex code for it, right? So there's that red, there's the yellow, there's the green, there's the that. So there's a lot of tools like this, and Photoshop can generate these codes as well. So generally, when you're working with a web designer or a graphic designer, oftentimes they'll come up with these RGB codes as hex codes, because they're very easy to translate from your graphics program to your HTML and your CSS. So most colors that we specify throughout the semester will be specified as hex codes. Now, to make them a little bit easier to work with, Visual Studio Code does give you some sort of hint as you're using these. So if I type in this hex code here, you'll see that it kind of shows me a preview of what that color looks like. That's that colored square here. And in fact, if I hover over it, it'll give me a selector where I can kind of just drag around, and now I have a different color there. So I can even just save it, and then it's over here. So I can tweak the color kind of in Visual Studio Code fairly easily that way. So same thing here. I've got a preview of that blue that's being used for the header, and I could say, well, let's go and drag it, make it a green, save the file, and all of a sudden my text is a green. So Visual Studio Code actually makes those color codes pretty easy to work with. But I think as you work through the semester, you'll get more used to what these color codes mean, and be able to kind of look at a code and say, oh, okay, I kind of get, this is red, this is green, this is blue, so I can kind of figure out what that color might be. So there are different ways to again specify these color codes. using the names, I do occasionally use the names as well for just the common colors, like red and black and blue. You'll see that a lot throughout the examples, but large in part, if I need a very specific color, I'll use one of these. These are these intermediate ones here are very seldom used in the real world. They are there, but very few web developers and web designers actually use those specify colors that way. So here's that example. We kind of started looking at that already. Switch back over. So we've got the body, for instance, here is specified as this light yellow, and we've got, which is a background color. That's the background color versus color is the text color. So I specified the header, is kind of a blue. So if we were to look at this page, say without CSS, without the colors applied, it would look like something like that. And if I look at it with those colors applied, you can see I've changed the background color and the text color. All right. Just some guidelines for accessibility when you're working with colors. You really do want to make sure that you're remembering the visual impaired in this process. That means people that are colorblind, whether that be red, green colorblind, or any of the other varieties of color blindness there is. Visual impairment can include people that are just hard of seeing in general as well. The thing to do in terms of accessibility is you want to make sure that you're always having a high amount of contrast between what's in the foreground and what's in the background. So practically, that often means having dark text on a light background, or more specifically, if you have black on top of white, that's even easier to read, right? So dark text on top of a light background does make text easy to read. That's a good general rule of thumb, but even more than that, black on white is even better. You can also flip that around and put light text on a dark background. A lot of times it's called a dark theme. This is a lot of users nowadays, especially developers, really prefer a dark theme, simply from the idea that it reduces eye strain. If you have a light text on a dark background, it does not cause as much eye strain to read it. So you can do either way, light text on dark or dark text on light, but you want to make sure that there's a lot of difference, a lot of separation between the lightness of your text and the lightness of your background. So there are some other ways to specify colors as of CSS3. So you can specify the red, green, blue channels like we showed earlier. You can also add an opacity value. So that opacity value is from 0 to 1. 0 being it's completely transparent. You can see through that text or color or whatever thing it is. And 1 being it's fully opaque. By default, all of your colors will be completely opaque. So if you want some transparency, that's what that opacity value is for. You can also specify your colors using HSL, or hue, saturation, lightness. This is something that may seem a little bit odd to people who are more from a developer background, but is more intuitive from somebody who is a graphic designer. So hue kind of represents the color, saturation is how pure that color is, and lightness is how bright or dark that color is. The upside of using HSL formatting is it does make it a little bit easier to tweak the color and change it to be a little bit darker, a little bit lighter than it is if you're just working with the hex codes directly. So that's where this comes in. From a graphic designer perspective, it does make the colors a little bit easier to tweak. But it's a different format. It's a different color palette to kind of look at. So that's HSL. Oftentimes when you see that, they'll be represented as sort of a circular color wheel. I don't know if I can get that from here. Okay. So some examples of that we might see here, kind of a semi-transparent blue. So the first color is at 0, 0, and the color wheel is basically going to be your blue. Let me go to example 5 here, because I think there's an example that goes with this. Yeah, so 5. Let's pull this up in Live Server. There we go. So you can see some of these kind of example colors. So semi-transparent blue would be this. That first number basically represents the hue, which is this bar. On the right is the hue bar. And then you have the saturation, which is kind of in here. The horizontal axis of this is kind of your saturation to some extent. But then you also have the vertical up and down, which is your lightness. So basically, these two numbers represent where it is horizontally and vertically in there is the way you can think about it. And then this bar here is transparency. So that's HSL. Again, 120 here kind of gives us a green. So 0 degrees is a blue. 120 degrees is a green. And at 240 we have somewhere kind of that's bluish. So then we have the lightness and brightness. So that's how that works out. You can kind of see those next to each other on the slides as far as what those look like. So we just finished. So we talked about measurements. We've talked a little bit about colors. The next thing to talk about is going to be a little bit about the selectors that we have and use. So with the selectors, pull these slides, or maybe I'll just go off of I'll just go off of here. So let's look at the next example. So we've got these selectors, close others. And I'm going to open this up in Live Server. So if we look at the HTML here, we've got main tag, we've got an H1 tag, we've got P, paragraph tags, and the footer and the paragraph tags. What we've also got in here is both of these two paragraphs are assigned the class blue. In this paragraph is assigned two things. It's assigned an ID of copyright, but it's also assigned a class of both blue and right. Anytime you see a space here, that actually means that this tag is assigned more than one class. So remember, a tag can only ever have one ID, and the ID has to be unique throughout the page, whereas the class does not have to be unique. I can use the same class for multiple things, and one tag can have more than one class. So here it's going to get the styles for both blue and right. Okay, so if we look at what the CSS for those is, first up top we have a star here. This star selector, that's what we call a universal selector. A universal selector selects all tags. Okay, so every tag in the document, in this document, is going to get this margin applied to it. So it's going to be, it's going to have that margin applied to it for everything. Then I go down to main. Well, main has got a black border around, which you can see there. So this would be a type selector. We're selecting it based on the type of the tag. It's a main tag. Similarly with H1 and P, all three of these are type selector because we're selecting based on the type of tag, whether it be main, H1, or P. Okay. The next example that we have in here is we're selecting by the ID. So I'm saying the ID is copyright. Well, when I'm selecting by ID, I need to remember to put that hash in front of it. So the hash in front of it means that it's an ID selector. And then the next two pieces that we have, these are both class selectors. Okay, so we know they're a class selector because they start with B, start with that dot. Note that if I remove that dot, right, so now I have a type selector, I'm trying to select for the blue tag. Well, but there's no blue, right? So all that text that was blue is no longer blue. So do make sure that when you're selecting by class, that's one of the common kind of mistakes is to forget to put that dot there. But notice that I'm selecting more than one element. More than one element is getting that blue. So I'm saying everything that has class blue, which is these two paragraphs as well as the footer here, that is being applied the blue color. And we can see that anything that's applied the right class, which is just the copyright, and that is being aligned to the right. So this stuff is all left aligned. That is right aligned because I've told it to right align that text. Okay, so we have universal selectors, we have type selectors, we have an ID selector here, and then we can also have class selectors. Those are the main different ways to select elements and apply CSS to them. So there's some additional. There are some additional ways to select CSS. The next one we're going to talk about is relational selectors. Okay, so if we look at this HTML that we have here, and let me pull this up in live server so we can see what it actually looks like in the browser. Right, so we have at the top, we have a main tag, right, and inside of that main, we've got an H1, which is that header. We've got an unordered list of speakers, right? So that's that list here. We've got 3 different items in there, so that's where we have an LI. So LI, LI, LI. But within each of those list items, we have a link to the respective speaker. So we've got an A tag in there to provide that link. Then beneath that list, we have an H2. And then beneath that, we have a paragraph and another paragraph and another paragraph. Well, inside this paragraph, we have some emphasized text, which is making that italic. And then finally at the bottom, we have the footer with some paragraph in it. So that's kind of the structure of the page. Well, and remember the whole point of HTML, the purpose of HTML is to define the semantics or the structure of our web page, and then CSS is what we're using to style it, to make it look good. So if I were to take this, I can kind of think of the HTML as a family tree. Okay, and this is very helpful, both thinking about how we're going to use these what we call relational selectors, which rely on this thinking of the HTML as a tree, as well as some of the stuff that we'll do with JavaScript. We'll come back in this and we'll talk about what we call this is the DOM, the document object model. But we can think of these relationships between tags as a family tree and use actually the terminology of a family tree to discuss it. So up at the very top of the document, right, or the root, I might say that there is a main, right? So there is the body above it. We're just talking about just the main right now. And there's also the footer in here that's not on this diagram. So I have the main, which is kind of at the root. And then inside of main, I have a header. I have an unordered list. I have an H2. And I have 3 series of paragraphs. Well, inside of the unordered list, there's also 3 list items. Inside of each of those list items, there's an anchor tag. And then inside of this paragraph, there is an emphasis tag, right? So I can graph this out. I can take any valid HTML document and graph it out as a tree like this. So when we're talking about relationships, and we can talk about relationships in the same way that we would, again, if this was a family tree. So if I wanted to talk about parents, I'm going up in the tree. So I would say that the parent of H1 is the main tag, or the parent of the unordered list is the main tag, or vice versa. I could say the anchor tag, its parent is the li tag. Now I wouldn't say that the parent necessarily of the a tag is the ul tag, at least not, it's not directly, right? The ul is not the direct parent of the li. It's in what we would call an ascendant, right? So if we're looking at the way this works, so we've got the a tag all the way down here. Well, its ascendants are li, ul, and main, but its parent is specifically just the li. Okay, its parent is specifically just the ul. We can go the other way and work down, so we can say H1 is a child of main, or we could say the ul is a child of main, or I can talk more generally and talk about the descendants. So all of these tags down here are descendants of main because they're somewhere inside of it. Okay, or if I want to talk about the ul tag specifically, its descendants are these tags underneath. Its descendants are the li tags as well as the anchor tags. Okay, so we can talk about ascendants and descendants kind of going up and down the tree. We're also, and parent and children go up and down the tree one step. We'd also talk about siblings. So for instance, if I look at this, well, these are at the same level, so they would be siblings, right? Or I can look at inside the UL. Well, these three tags, they're siblings. They're not connected to EM. EM would not be a sibling, even though it's kind of at the same level because it has a different parent. So these LI tags are all siblings. Now, when we talk about siblings and we look at these selectors, one thing that's specific to the way these CSS selectors work, we're talking about siblings, we're only talking about the tags afterward. So for instance, if we're looking at the H2, H2 is the adjacent sibling of UL. Okay, it's immediately next to it. So UL has this adjacent sibling, or if I want to look at all the siblings for UL, it would just be H2, P, PP. It wouldn't, the general siblings, the siblings of the UL would not include the tags before, such as the H1. Okay, so how do we specify these, how do we use these relationships in CSS? Okay, so there's some additional characters and operators that we use to define relationships like this. So the first and simplest one that we use is called the descendant selector. So the descendant selector is you just say, hey, I put a space between the two different selectors, so I have a main and then space li. So this would be any li tags that are descendants of a main tag. So take the main tags and find all of their descendants that are li's at any level. Same way here, I might say take the UL tag and find any anchor tags that are descendants of it. So things to notice there, if I'm looking at the descendants of main that are li's, notice that those are not directly next to each other. So main and li's are down here. They have the UL in between. So if I say main space li, I'm referring to all of these li's here. Okay, I'm referring to all three of those li's. But notice that those are not what we would call direct descendants. They're not directly children, but they are descendants of main. Similarly, if we're looking at the UL and the A, notice that there's an li in between, right? So when you're writing descendant selectors, there may be other things in between, or there may not be anything in between. They may be direct children. You get both. On the other hand, if I want to be more strict, I can use what's called the child selector. This is also known as the direct descendant selector. And that's where I put this greater than between there. So rather than just a space, I put a greater than symbol. So I say main greater than P. So this would only be P tags that are direct descendants of the main, or anchor tags that are direct descendants of LI. So it's not just somewhere underneath, it has to be directly, one level down, not more than one. So this is more strict. We use both of these quite a bit. Both direct descendant selectors as well as descendant selectors are very, very helpful, especially when we get talking about how to build navigation bars, nav bars. These are definitely a must, as well as for a lot of other things. Okay, we can also specify siblings, and there's two different ways to specify siblings. So I can say H2 plus H1. Okay, so H2 plus H1, that would refer to the adjacent sibling. So if I'm looking at it on this tree, this first paragraph would be the adjacent sibling to the H2. Okay, so the adjacent sibling would be this one. It would not include the other two paragraphs here. Whereas if I were to say the general sibling, which is this tilde, I would say, well, H2 tilde P, well, that would include all the siblings. So that would include all three of these. And remember, both of these sibling selectors only select the tags afterward. They don't select any paragraphs that come before. So that's how that works. So we do plus and just get this one, or you can get tilde and get all three of those. So those are our relational selectors. We can also combine the selectors that we've already talked about. So for instance, if I want to say, I want a tag that's both a UL tag, I want to select it by type, and I want to select it by class, I can take the type, they say dot the class name. So this would be selecting tags that are ULs and have the class of speakers. Okay, anything that's just a UL or just has the class of speakers but is some other tag would not be selected by this. So this is more specific than just dot speakers or just UL. Okay, so I'm making that more specific about what kind of tags I'm looking at. Okay, I can also combine multiple rules into one using commas. So this will say, I want all the H1s or the H2s or the H3s. It will select all of those, but they're separate selectors. This is with the comma, it's not a descendant. It's not talking about the descendants, and it's not talking about combining these things where it has to be like, yes, it's an H1 and it's an H2 and it's an H3. It's just saying any H1s or any H2s or any H3s, we're going to make all of those blue. I can also combine them and combine both of these two ideas together. So for instance, I could say P, any paragraph tags, or, it's what basically the way you can think about the comma is an or. Say any paragraphs or any that fit this rule. So this rule says, okay, we need to find a UL that has the speaker class, and then any direct descendants, any children that are LI tags, well, we're going to select those. So we're going to say just the LI tags that are inside of a UL speaker, plus all the paragraph tags. Okay. Another type of selector we can use is what's called an attribute selector, and we use these square brackets for it. So what this says, would be any tag, any element that has the href attribute. Regardless of value, if it has the href attribute, then we're going to select it. Okay, so this is any tags that have the href attribute. This would be a combination then of those. I would say only the anchor tags that have the href attribute. So for instance, there are some other tags in the HTML that can have that href attribute, and I don't care about those. I just want the anchor tags with href. Okay, so that makes it more, that would be more specific. I can also specify that they need to have a value. So here I would say I want all the input tags where they do have a type attribute, but that type attribute has to be submit, right? So if the attribute, the type attribute was type equals reset, they should not be selecting this. If it was type button, type text, any of those other types, this would not select those. It would only select ones with the type specifically being that value. So I can say either the href is anything, this attribute is anything, or I can say this attribute has to be a specific value. So both of these things, these attribute selectors can be helpful, especially when we get into more complex sort of pages, especially when we start dealing with forms. So as soon as we start wanting to take user data, these attribute selectors are really, really helpful. But for the early stuff that we're doing, you may not see this again for a little bit. So just keep it in mind, take a note of it, because we'll come back to it later, even though we're not necessarily going to do a whole lot with these attribute selectors yet. We're going to focus on most of the other kinds. Another way to select elements with your rules is to use what we call pseudo classes. So pseudo classes are, we don't actually define that class in the HTML, but they're kind of dynamically generated and they dynamically applied. So if I look at, let's say, the pseudo example, pull up pseudo, run that with live server. So typically those first two pseudo classes, visited and link, this refers to anchor tags. They only apply to anchor tags. So link : link represents a link that you have not visited, and a : visited represents links that you have visited. So usually we use that to change the color of links, and to change it based on whether or not you followed that link before. If you set the link color, you should always set the visited color as well. And one of the things you should notice in here, remember for classes we use a dot. For pseudo classes we use a colon. Okay, and in this, so both of those styles are really link and visited. Those really are only ever used. They only ever work with anchor tags. The other pseudo classes that we look at here in a minute aren't just anchor tags. You can use them on anchor tags. We often do, but that's not the only place that they are used. So for instance, here I've said I want the anchor tags that are hovered and the anchor tags that are focused, and I'm going to change their color to fuchsia. Okay, so what that means is if I hover over it here, you can see that the color changes, right? So it goes from a green to a fuchsia when I hover over it. Similar, focus deals with the keyboard. So if I kind of select some text here, I'm going to hit tab. You can see it going through as I tab through the controls. It's giving that line on the outside, but it's also changing the color. So focus is the pseudo class for the current element that has focus. That can be links, it can be input fields, it can be buttons. We'll talk a lot more about focus in the upcoming weeks. So the focus pseudo class lets us apply styling to the specific element that currently has keyboard focus, and hover allows us to apply styling to elements that the mouse is hovering over. Now, one thing to keep in mind for both of those things, there's really not a concept of hover when you're talking about a touch device, say a mobile phone, a smartphone, or a tablet. So typically those hover styles don't really work in a mobile context, because there's not the concepts of kind of where is your mouse cursor, and it always has to be somewhere. It's only ever there when the user's touching the screen. which means they're doing something. So hover styles are great for desktop and laptop users, but don't really work well if you're using a smartphone or a tablet. So they're not really mobile friendly. Versus focus still exists in the mobile world. So one really important rule as you're applying these pseudo classes, anytime you apply styling to hover, you should also apply that same styling to focus, because typically that's going to be the kind of equivalency between mobile and non-mobile, or users that are primarily just using the keyboard, or users that are using the mouse. Okay, so those are pseudo classes, right? They refer to elements that dynamically kind of get those classes. Okay, there's also this concept of there's also 3 other pseudo classes that we can use here. So first child refers to the first child, right? So I can say here I've saying I want to refer to the first paragraph, right? So there's 2 paragraphs here, main P, first child, so this would be the first paragraph. This would be the first paragraph inside of main. Okay. I can also refer to first letter. So let's look at what we're doing here. So first child, we're saying let's make the first paragraph bold, and then we're saying the first letter of the first child, I want to make that font size bigger. So I'm making this first letter here, that first letter is bigger. So one minor distinction here, if we're looking at pseudo classes versus pseudo elements, okay, so pseudo classes start with a single colon, pseudo elements start with 2 colons. Okay, that's the difference between the two in terms of the code is concerned. If it's a single colon, it's a pseudo class. If it's a double colon, it's a pseudo element. So pseudo elements pseudo classes always refer to things that are tags, but a pseudo element is something that's not actually a tag, but you can kind of treat it as if it is a tag. So for instance, if we're talking about the first letter, you'll notice that there's no tag around that W, right? So that's why it's a pseudo element, because we're creating an element there that doesn't really exist in the HTML. Same thing with first line. First line, if you're word wrapping, if we had enough text here, first line would refer to that first line of text. And again, that wouldn't really have a tag because that will change as you make the browser wider or narrower. Where it decides to word wrap would change, so that would be applied differently. So we got this idea of first letter and first line. There are some additional pseudo classes and pseudo elements that we aren't talking about here, which we will probably talk about at a later point. But this is your kind of your first introduction to those selectors. So the big thing to focus on here is using these link, visited, hover, focus, using those classes allows us to make our links look a lot better. So we're going to use this rule that refers to link and visited to the normal color of the link, and then we would use hover and focus to refer to what's the kind of active color of the link when the user hovers over it or when they apply keyboard focus to it. Okay. I mentioned this already, but an accessibility guideline for hover and focus is that you always want them to be the same. You should always join those together like so with a comma and say both of these things get the same style. And that way users that aren't using the mouse or are using your website in a mobile setting, they'll have the same user experience ideally. So thinking about, again, the order of how things are applied in terms of CSS, sometimes we want to change that. So remember, as these styles are applied, there's some rules are more specific or applied over other rules. So if one style says this color should be fuchsia and another style says this should be green, well, which one do I use, right? Should this link be green or should it be fuchsia? Well, it's going to use this one because it is what we would say more specific. So there is a way to change specificity, and that is with this important keyword. So I can do exclamation mark important to make something more important. Now, the order of the things are applied in terms of specificity. Inline styles are always the most specific, so those override everything. The next would be any rules that you've applied as important. And the next beneath that would be any rules that are not important. And then beneath that would be rules that the browser has built in. So these are gonna override, the inline styles are gonna override the important ones, and the important ones are gonna override the normal ones, and the normal ones are override the web browser's default rules. So what does this look like if I want to use important? Well, if I want to mark something as important, I simply just add it after the value. So I'm saying here I want this text that I've given class highlight, I want it to be bold, and I'm going to make that important so that it overrides any other font styling that might be there that says, oh, this shouldn't be bold, it should be underlined, or whatever it may be. So sometimes that's needed to override another rule to make your rule more specific. Do be careful that this important keyword is something you should definitely use sparingly, because once you've made it important, well, you can't make it doubly important, right? So you've already raised the importance. That may then cause some issues. So you do want to be a little bit careful with how you apply this important, but there are definitely a lot of places where this can be useful to change the specificity or change the way your rules are evaluated. So in general, talking about specificity in a little bit more, in the cascade in a little bit more granular level, rules are always applied. You always end up with a rule that is more specific. Okay, whatever rule is more specific is the one that wins out, that gets to apply its properties. If there is another rule, if there are multiple rules in a particular group of roles, then it's with the same kind of specificity, then it's going to be the one that's applied last in the document. So the order that you have them specified in your CSS file does matter. The later ones override the ones before it. Okay, so as a general rule, talking about specificity in the groups, so inline styles, as I said, are the most specific, really. And then beneath inline styles, you have the ID. Selectors by the ID are specific. And then next beneath that would be composite or relational selectors. Those combinations increase anytime you have a relational selector. That makes it more important, or saying you want it to have both this tag and this class, that increases the specificity as it is as well. And then next group down would be class selectors and attribute selectors and pseudo class selectors. Those are less specific. And then finally, at the very bottom tier of that would be element or pseudo element selectors. Those are always the least specific. So if I say I just want to refer to all the p tags, well, that would be down here at the bottom of the specificity kind of hierarchy. Now, there is a way to see these things, to see what rule, all the rules that are being applied to an element, and how specific they are. If you look, or what order they're applied, if you look into the web browser. So let's say I pull up this example here. So this is, what page is that? That is the book apps. Okay, so I'm going to go open folder, Murach, book apps. This is the chapter 4 book example, book app, and we're going to go to town hall. So this is the town hall example. So let me open this with live server. Okay, so there's a lot of different rules that are applied to the elements here, and I may be curious about what those are and how they're applied. So if I say, let's look at the header here, I'm going to right click that and then go to inspect. Okay, so inspect will let me see both the HTML and the CSS that is behind that element. Okay, so here I'm looking at this H2 element. Is that the right one? I think maybe. Okay, so H2, I can hover over it and kind of see it highlighting there. And if I look at what's on the right here, this is then showing me the CSS that's being applied. So I can see that there's a rule for header H2, any H2 tags that are inside of the header. And we can see this is coming from main CSS, well, colon. The colon means what line it is. So on line 18, there's this rule that's being applied, or definition. So we've got, let's set the font size to 220, let's set the color, let's set the text line, let's set the text shadow. And I can turn each of these off in the web browser to just see what that would affect. So for instance, if I uncheck font size, you can see that it becomes smaller. So I can see, well, what would happen if I hadn't set the font size there? You know, what would it look like? What would it look like if I didn't set it to orange? Well, okay, it would be black. If I didn't set it to be center aligned, you can see it would be left aligned. If I didn't apply a shadow, well, the shadow wouldn't be there. So you can go through each of these rules and you can say, well, turn those things off and on, but you can also see that there are two rules here that are being applied. So the first one is this main CSS. That's the one that's more specific. The most specific rule that's being applied. And then beneath that, there's also a rule for H2s, which, as it says, comes from the user agent style sheet. So the user agent style sheet means this is from Chrome. So Chrome already applies all of these styles to any H2 tags. And we're saying, here's what I want to change from what the browser default is to what I want it to look different. Okay, so let's see if I can find in main, there's an H1. So the H1 has more than one rule applied, has some more rules applied. So here we look at H1. First of all, there's the user agent string down at the bottom, lowest specificity, and then to that, normalized CSS is applying a rule to all of the H1s, and then our main CSS is applying a rule to main, all the H1s that are in main, and setting their font size to 170. So you can see the order that those take precedence. And you can see right here, you see how the font size is crossed out, as well as how it's crossed out in the user agent style sheet. That's saying that these rules, while they are present, they don't actually have an effect because there's something overriding. So for instance, if I were to remove this rule here, you can see that one's no longer crossed out. If I uncross that one, that was now also crossed out. So now we'd be back to the web browsers determining those things. So the general way to get into there's a few different ways to get into those developer tools. The first way to get into there is just right click on an element and say inspect. The other way you can get in here is by pressing F12 on your keyboard. So bring it up like that. So F12 on your keyboard, right click inspect, or you can go to tools. That triple bar here in Chrome, I'm going to go to more tools, and I'm going to go down to developer tools. That is the other way to get in here. So you can get in here any of those three ways. Usually most developers are going to get in there either through the F12 key or by inspecting. And most browsers at this point, it's generally standardized as being the F12 key is to get into your developer tools regardless of browser, and most browsers you can right click and inspect with as well now. So those are pretty universal. Let me go back to my slides and let's look at what's next. So we talked a little bit about this. You can either use F12 to get in there, right click and inspect, and then, yeah, and we talked about how to see the styles. Okay, so I'm going to take a quick break here. I meant to take a break a little bit sooner, but we're at a good stopping point. So let's go ahead and take a break and come back and we'll do the next part of Chapter 4, where we're going to talk more about fonts. So just to review what we've talked about in this section, we talked first about measurements, some of the different measurements that are available in CSS. We talked about how to apply colors, and then we had talked about some of the different selectors that are available. So from the universal selector to the type selector, the class selector, the ID selector. We talked a bit about the different relational selectors that are available, as well as how to combine those. We also then just briefly got done with looking at some of the developer tools that you can use to inspect the CSS in the actual browser to see what's going on, and to kind of play around with it to see, well, what would happen if I did this instead? How would that change things? Without having to go directly change the code, you can just kind of muck with it and see, okay, figure out what you need to do and what's going on. So we'll talk more about fonts in the next video, how to work with those. One thing to make note of, we were talking about measurements. I forgot to mention this before when we were talking about them and before we get done here. Measurements, it seems like if you remember right, there's a few different ways, a few different units that we can use for specifying measurements. And that may seem like maybe a lot for you if you're not too familiar with CSS. So like, why would I need more than why can't I just specify everything in pixels? Well, those different units are probably one of the most valuable things with CSS. They're one of the reasons that they're one of the ways that CSS is really, really good in a mobile space or at different screen resolutions, and it's one of the reasons that it's continued to be so popular. Is those different measurements make it real easy to adapt our UIs to different devices, whether they be larger screens or smaller screens, whether they be screens that have a higher or lower densities, or whether it be just resizing the window and things like that. So those units and mastering those can really help you build websites that are compatible and responsive to a lot of different device configurations. And interestingly enough, CSS HTML is one of the few technologies that has actually all those options. For the most part, nearly all other UI frameworks really only give you one option, and that's pixels. Most other frameworks only give you the option of measuring things in pixels. which actually does make it hard to adapt your layouts to different devices. So that is one of the benefits of say, maybe building a responsive website over building a native app, whether it be a native Windows app or whether it be a native Android or iPhone app, is if you do that, you don't necessarily have access to all of those different types and styles of measurement, which can make it a lot harder to adapt it to different devices. Whereas, well, HTML, CSS got that built in. So those measurements are really, really helpful, and I hope that by the end of the semester that you have a much better grasp of when you use those measurements and how they work. But that's just something to keep in mind. That's maybe a little bit long-winded and to tack on at the end, but I'm going to shut it off here, and I will see you again in the next part where we talk about fonts.